Welcome to History for the Night, a place where the past unfolds slowly, gently, and meaningfully, guiding you toward rest while nourishing the mind. Here, history is not rushed. It breathes. It speaks in calm voices, inviting you to listen, reflect, and drift into sleep with a sense of quiet understanding. In these nighttime journeys, we return to distant centuries, ancient ideas, secret traditions, and forgotten worlds, not to overwhelm, but to soothe. Each story is carefully told so that knowledge becomes comfort and learning becomes rest. Before we begin, take a moment to make yourself comfortable. If you haven't yet, feel free to subscribe and support the channel. By the end of this lecture, your mind will be at ease and your thoughts will be far away in another time. Now gently close your eyes. Let the noise of the day fade. The present loosens its grip, and the past softly opens its doors. Our story begins. Building guilds, history and development. The history of Freemasonry is an entire universe of mysteries, secrets, and legends that for centuries has captivated the human imagination. Even the mere mention of the Freemasons evokes curiosity. Associations with secret societies, hidden rituals, symbolic objects, and veiled meanings. Yet behind this romantic and often mystical image lies a very real and traceable historical foundation, one that stretches from the Middle Ages to the modern world. The very word Freemasonry comes from the French Francmaçon, meaning Freemason, and this origin is no coincidence. In the earliest stage of their existence, Freemasons were not philosophers or thinkers, but skilled craftsmen and master builders, stonemasons, and architects who raised the great castles, cathedrals, and monasteries of medieval Europe. These monumental structures were not simply buildings. They were embodiments of faith, power, knowledge, and human ambition reaching toward the heavens. The builders responsible for them possessed highly specialized knowledge. Techniques of stone cutting, geometry, architectural balance, and structural stability were not written down in public manuals. Instead, they were guarded carefully and passed orally from master to apprentice. To protect these secrets from outsiders and competitors, the builders formed closed professional communities known as guilds. Entry into these guilds was strictly limited. Only those who proved their skill, discipline, and loyalty could be admitted. Over time, these building guilds developed into something far more than professional associations. They became brotherhoods bound by mutual responsibility, shared values, and an internal moral code. Members supported one another in times of hardship, protected trade secrets, and maintained strict hierarchies that ensured knowledge was transferred accurately and responsibly. An apprentice learned under a master, gradually advancing through ranks not only by skill, but by character. The lodge, the place where masons worked, gathered, and rested, it became both a physical and symbolic space. It was here that knowledge was shared, decisions were made, and bonds were forged. Symbols such as the square, the compass, and the level were originally practical tools of the trade, but they also began to take on ethical and philosophical meanings within these communities. As the Middle Ages gave way to the Renaissance, European society began to change. Scientific thinking expanded, education spread beyond monasteries, and architectural knowledge slowly became less secretive. The practical need for closed guilds of builders diminished. Fewer mysteries remained in stonework, and the world itself was opening to new intellectual horizons. At this turning point, the nature of the guilds began to transform. Gradually, they started admitting individuals who were not professional builders at all, but who were deeply interested in philosophy, ethics, science, and spirituality. These new members were often scholars, thinkers, or influential men seeking a space for intellectual reflection and moral development. This marked a profound shift. Literal construction of cathedrals gave way to symbolic construction of the self. The tools of stonework became metaphors, building a better human being, shaping society through virtue, discipline, and reason. What once was the craft of shaping stone turned into a philosophical system focused on inner perfection and moral architecture. It is precisely this transformation from operative masonry to speculative masonry that explains much of Freemasonry's enduring mystery. The old symbols remained, but their meanings deepened. The traditions stayed intact, but their purpose evolved. The language of builders became the language of philosophers. To truly understand Freemasonry, one must begin here with the medieval building guilds that formed its foundation. These communities of craftsmen unknowingly laid the first stones of a brotherhood that would later transcend architecture, becoming one of the most influential and enigmatic movements in human intellectual history. Training of stonemasons. Secrets and symbolism. Medieval Europe was a world where lofty ideals existed alongside exhausting labor and a constant struggle for survival. Wars, epidemics, famine, and superstition shaped everyday life. And yet, within this harsh and uncertain reality, extraordinary architectural masterpieces were born, structures so grand and refined that they continue to inspire even centuries later. Gothic cathedrals soaring toward the sky, massive castles, and stone monasteries did not appear by chance. Behind them stood the work of a very special group of people, professional stonemasons united in closed communities known as building guilds. Medieval stonemasons possessed an exceptional range of skills. They were not merely laborers shaping stone. They were engineers, architects, and artists at the same time. Their work required deep knowledge of physics, geometry, proportions, and structural balance. They had to understand how to distribute weight so that walls would stand for centuries, how to design arches and vaults that could carry immense loads, and how to decorate sacred spaces with beauty and symbolic meaning. Mastering these arts was not something that could be learned quickly. It required many years of disciplined training, patience, and practice. For this reason, the knowledge of stonemasons was guarded carefully. Over time, building guilds became closed professional unions with strict internal hierarchy and carefully regulated systems of teaching. A young apprentice usually entered a guild while still a teenager. For many years, he worked under the supervision of an experienced master, starting with the simplest tasks. Gradually, he learned how to select stone, how to cut and shape it, how to calculate measurements, and how to read architectural plans. Alongside practical skills, he studied mathematics, geometry, and the basic principles of construction. Only after proving competence and discipline could an apprentice become a journeyman, and later, after passing a serious examination, a master capable of leading projects and teaching others. This strict hierarchy was essential. The craft of stonemasonry contained secrets that allowed buildings to remain stable and beautiful for generations. These secrets included precise geometric proportions, the correct balance between structural elements, special mortar recipes, and advanced stoneworking techniques. To protect this knowledge, guilds developed systems of signs, symbols, and rituals that were understandable only to those initiated into the craft. Over time, these symbols began to carry meanings far beyond their practical purpose. They reflected not only professional skill, but also a worldview, a moral and philosophical understanding of life and human responsibility. Three tools became especially important and deeply symbolic: the compass, the square, and the trowel. The compass held special significance for stonemasons. It was used to measure distances and draw perfect circles, shapes associated with harmony, order, and completeness. In medieval thought, the circle symbolized divine perfection and cosmic balance. Using the compass in construction was seen as a way of translating a higher, divine plan into stone, connecting human labor with universal order. The square, used to ensure right angles and structural accuracy, also gained moral meaning. In a world filled with injustice and uncertainty, the right angle became a symbol of righteousness, honesty, and moral integrity. Through the symbol of the square, stonemasons reminded one another that a straight wall could not stand without precise angles, just as a just life could not exist without ethical principles. The trowel, a tool used to spread mortar and bind stones together, carried yet another symbolic dimension. Mortar alone holds no shape, but when used properly, it unites individual stones into a strong, unified structure. Symbolically, the trowel represented fraternity, unity, and mutual support. Just as mortar binds stones into a wall, solidarity binds members of the guild into a single brotherhood. These tools and symbols became central to the rituals and traditions of the guilds. Gradually, everyday construction work evolved into something greater than a profession. It became a way of understanding life, society, morality, and human purpose. As these traditions deepened, they began to attract people who were no longer builders themselves, but were drawn by the philosophical and ethical meanings hidden within the symbolism. Scholars, thinkers, and intellectuals saw in the language of stonemasons a powerful metaphor for inner development and moral construction. It was at this moment that the transformation began. Building guilds slowly moved beyond purely professional boundaries and started to evolve into intellectual brotherhoods. These brotherhoods would eventually become known to the world as Freemasonry, before Freemasonry emerged as a philosophical movement. However, the guilds had to pass through this crucial transition, a moment when secret knowledge, symbols, and traditions escaped the narrow circle of craftsmen and began to influence the intellectual elite of Europe. This pivotal shift, from medieval stonework to symbolic and philosophical construction, is what we will explore in the next part of our journey. The transition of guilds into intellectual communities. The transformation from a purely practical craft into a philosophical and intellectual community began in the late 15th century and developed most actively during the 16th century. This was a time of profound change in Europe. Medieval society was gradually giving way to a new worldview shaped by the growth of science, the weakening of absolute church authority, and the emergence of fresh ideas about humanity, nature, and reason. These sweeping changes created fertile ground for transformation within the Masonic lodges as well. Previously, the doors of the guilds had been open exclusively to professional builders and architects. But now more and more people from entirely different backgrounds began to enter these closed circles. Among the first of these new speculative masons were representatives of the intellectual elite, philosophers, scientists, mathematicians, alchemists, physicians, and members of the aristocracy. They were drawn by deep questions about the nature of the universe, the human mind, morality, and the hidden order of reality. What attracted them most was the unique intellectual freedom offered by the lodges. Within their walls, it was possible to explore ethical and spiritual questions without the rigid pressure of religious dogma or political authority. Among these early intellectual masons were notable figures such as the Scottish physician and alchemist Robert Murray, the renowned philosopher Elias Ashmole, and the Scottish mathematician and astronomer James Gregory. One of the earliest regions where this transformation clearly took shape was Scotland. As early as the 16th century, lodges in Edinburgh and other cities began actively admitting people who had no direct connection to the practical work of stonemasonry. In these Scottish lodges, stone and building tools gradually lost their literal meaning and became powerful allegories through which moral and philosophical ideas were explored. Great attention was devoted to the study of ancient texts and legends. Discussions centered on ethics, personal integrity, and the spiritual refinement of the individual. Members explored how the symbolic language of construction could be applied to the inner development of character, how a person, like a building, could be shaped, refined, and strengthened through discipline and self-awareness. These lodges developed a distinctive internal culture that blended ancient legends, esoteric ideas, and strict ethical codes. Meetings were held behind closed doors, often by candlelight, surrounded by symbols and rituals adapted from old building traditions. It was in this atmosphere that the practice of initiation took shape, a special ceremonial process through which new members were admitted. During initiation, a candidate was expected to demonstrate not professional skills, but an understanding of moral principles and philosophical concepts central to the lodge. Lodges usually gathered in specially designated halls or even in private homes, where members could freely and confidentially exchange ideas. Within these spaces, participants read and discussed the works of ancient philosophers, medieval alchemists, and contemporary thinkers. They debated the most complex questions of existence, morality, knowledge, and the purpose of life without fear of persecution or accusations of heresy. Beyond Scotland, a similar transition unfolded in France. In French lodges of the 17th century, members included not only scholars and philosophers, but also representatives of the high nobility. For many aristocrats, lodge membership became a prestigious intellectual pursuit, a mark of refinement, education, and elevated status. Within French lodges, philosophical discussion was often accompanied by mystical exploration and symbolic interpretations of ancient traditions. These traditions were sometimes linked to medieval knightly orders, alchemy, and Kabbalistic thought. In this way, Freemasonry gradually evolved into a rich intellectual ecosystem, one that combined Enlightenment ideals, ancient wisdom, moral philosophy, and symbolic ritual into a unified brotherhood of ideas. This crucial transition marked the moment when Freemasonry ceased to be merely an extension of medieval craftsmanship and began its path as a philosophical and spiritual movement, a brotherhood devoted not to building cathedrals of stone, but to shaping the inner architecture of the human mind and soul. The formation of the United Grand Lodge of England in the summer of 1717. An event took place in London that would permanently reshape the history of Freemasonry and elevate it to an entirely new level of influence and organization. On June 24th, the feast day of St. John the Baptist, a date already rich in symbolic meaning for Masons, representatives of four independent London lodges gathered at a well-known tavern called the Goose and Greedy. During this meeting, they reached a historic agreement to unite under a single central authority. This new body later became known as the Grand Lodge of London and Westminster. From this moment, historians traditionally trace the beginning of modern, organized Freemasonry. Before this turning point, Masonic lodges were small, largely autonomous groups, often unconnected to one another. Within these lodges, members discussed philosophical ideas, moral improvement, and symbolic traditions. But there was no unified structure, no common leadership, and no standardized rituals binding them together. The four London lodges meeting at the Goose and Gridiron, the Crown, the Apple Tree, and the Cup and Grapes taverns recognized the need for a centralized organization. They agreed to establish shared rules, unified traditions, and common rituals. This decision was not spontaneous. It was the result of growing awareness that Freemasonry required an authoritative structure capable of organizing lodge activity and enhancing the overall prestige of the Brotherhood. The first Grand Master of the newly formed organization was Anthony Sayer. He was a respected figure within the lodges, though not a person of high rank or significant political influence. Yet even during the first years of its existence, The Grand Lodge began to attract members of England's aristocracy and social elite. A decisive turning point came in 1721, when John Montagu, Duke of Montagu, became Grand Master, a powerful and well-connected nobleman at the royal court. His appointment dramatically increased the standing of the Grand Lodge. From that moment, membership in Freemasonry became not only an intellectual pursuit, but also a mark of prestige and fashion among England's educated and influential classes. One of the most important missions of the Grand Lodge was the standardization of Masonic practice. It was during this period that the now familiar three-degree system was firmly established: entered apprentice, fellow craft, and master mason. Each degree was carefully designed and filled with philosophical meaning, moral instruction, and symbolic actions. These initiation ceremonies were intended to guide members through a process of ethical and intellectual growth, teaching principles of integrity, self-discipline, fraternity, and mutual responsibility. In addition to ritual structure, the Grand Lodge introduced formal constitutional documents to regulate lodge life. The most famous of these was the Constitutions of the Freemasons, written in 1723 by James Anderson, a Scottish Presbyterian minister and prominent Mason. In this influential text, Anderson systematized Masonic rules, outlined traditions, defined relations between lodges, and articulated foundational principles of Masonic philosophy. The constitutions became the cornerstone of the entire Masonic movement. They were soon adopted by lodges far beyond England's borders and served as a blueprint for Freemasonry across Europe and, eventually, the wider world, thanks to its clear organization and disciplined structure. The Grand Lodge of London quickly gained international authority. Freemasonry began attracting philosophers, writers, scientists, diplomats, and cultural figures, individuals drawn by the ideals of enlightenment, tolerance, human dignity, and open intellectual exchange. Within lodge walls, members could freely discuss ideas of social progress and reason without fear of censorship or persecution. From England, Masonic principles spread rapidly across Europe, reaching France, Germany, the Netherlands, and other countries. Within just a few decades, lodges were also established in North America, where they would play a significant role in intellectual life and, eventually, in political history. Thus, the creation of the Grand Lodge in London was far more than a local event. It marked a defining moment in history, the point at which Freemasonry acquired its modern organizational form, laying the foundation for a global brotherhood whose influence would be felt across centuries. Masonic initiation, process, and meaning. With the establishment of clear structures and international standards, Freemasonry gradually transformed into an organization capable of influencing cultural, philosophical, and even political life across Europe. Yet at the heart of this vast and carefully ordered system stood a deeply personal experience for every member: initiation. For a Freemason, initiation was not merely a formality or ceremonial tradition. It was a profound symbolic journey, carefully designed to mark inner transformation and moral commitment. The initiation process was traditionally divided into 3 distinct stages, each representing a step in the spiritual, intellectual, and ethical development of the individual. These stages were never completed all at once. A candidate progressed gradually, often over months or even years, moving from one degree to the next only after demonstrating sincerity, discipline, and personal growth. The first initiation was that of the entered apprentice. This ceremony took place in a carefully prepared lodge room, arranged with symbolic objects and lighting. The candidate entered without knowing the full details of what awaited him. He was blindfolded and partially bare-chested, a powerful symbol of spiritual blindness, ignorance, vulnerability, and openness. In this state, he represented a person standing at the threshold of knowledge, aware of his limitations and ready to learn. Members of the lodge questioned the candidate about his intentions. They asked whether he sought knowledge sincerely, whether he was prepared to uphold moral and ethical principles, protect the secrets of the brotherhood, and commit himself to lifelong self-improvement. These questions were not tests of intelligence but of character. After answering, the candidate took a solemn oath, usually with his hand placed upon the Bible or another sacred text meaningful to him. Only then was the blindfold removed. The sudden exposure to light and the sight of the assembled brethren symbolized awakening, the transition from darkness to enlightenment. The new apprentice was instructed in the fundamental values of Freemasonry: integrity, restraint, humility, brotherhood, and moral responsibility. He received guidance on how to conduct himself both within the lodge and in the wider world. The second stage, the degree of fellowcraft, was granted only after senior members were satisfied with the candidate's dedication and progress. This initiation was more complex and intellectually demanding. It focused on the development of reason, understanding, and ethical awareness. During the ritual, the candidate undertook a symbolic journey through the lodge, encountering questions, challenges, and allegorical obstacles that required reflection rather than obedience. At this level, the initiate was expected to demonstrate an understanding of Masonic symbolism and to reflect on the individual's responsibility toward society, knowledge, and truth. The fellow craft was encouraged to study science, philosophy, and the natural order, recognizing that intellectual growth and moral strength must develop together. This stage emphasized balance, discipline, and conscious self-cultivation. The third and most significant degree was that of Master Mason. Admission to this stage was restricted to those who had successfully completed the earlier degrees and demonstrated maturity of character and thought. The ritual of this degree was the most dramatic and symbolically intense. Central to the ceremony was a symbolic reenactment of the legend of Hiram-Abiff, the master builder of King Solomon's temple, who was said to have been slain for refusing to reveal the secrets of his craft. During the ritual, the candidate played a role within this allegorical drama. Fellow members portrayed figures who demanded forbidden knowledge. When the candidate refused, he underwent a symbolic death represented through carefully choreographed actions. Lying motionless upon the lodge floor, the candidate experienced symbolic destruction of the old self, pride, fear, and ignorance. This moment of vulnerability and stillness stood at the emotional center of the ritual. He was then raised by the brethren through a specific ritual gesture known only to those initiated into the degree. This act symbolized rebirth or return to life, not as a novice, but as a transformed individual. The meaning of this ceremony was then explained with solemn clarity. Death was not literal, but symbolic, a reminder of the impermanence of physical existence. True immortality, Freemasonry taught, lay in moral integrity, service to others, and devotion to truth. The newly made Master Mason was entrusted with greater responsibility, not only toward the lodge, but toward society itself, receiving the symbols and obligations of mastery. The initiate was reminded that knowledge must be guided by wisdom, and power restrained by conscience. The Master Mason was expected to support younger brethren, act as a moral example, and contribute to the harmony and ethical strength of the world beyond the lodge walls. Thus, Masonic initiation was never simply about belonging. It was a structured inner journey from darkness to light, from ignorance to understanding, and from self-centered existence to responsibility grounded in ethical awareness and intellectual discipline. The all-seeing eye symbolism and meaning. The symbols of Freemasonry have long become objects of myth, speculation, and conspiracy theories. Over time, ancient legends, religious imagery, and modern fears of secret control over humanity have been woven together into dramatic narratives. Yet behind these fantasies lies a far more profound and intellectually rich reality. Each Masonic symbol has a concrete historical origin and a layered meaning that is often far more fascinating than the most sensational theories. One of the most recognizable and widely discussed of these symbols is the all-seeing eye. Also known as the Eye of Providence, the all-seeing eye is typically depicted as a single eye enclosed within a triangle and surrounded by radiant beams of light. To many modern observers, this image appears mysterious or even unsettling. However, its roots stretch far back into the earliest civilizations. In ancient Egypt, a similar symbol known as the Eye of Horus represented divine protection, cosmic order, and sacred wisdom. It was believed to guard against chaos and to embody the watchful presence of higher forces. Centuries later, during the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, the image of a radiant eye was adopted into Christian iconography. In this context, it symbolized the omniscience of God, the belief that nothing could be hidden from divine awareness. God, in this interpretation, was not a distant ruler but a moral observer, watching over human actions and intentions. It was this Christian meaning that Freemasonry would later inherit and reinterpret. When the all-seeing eye appeared in Masonic lodges, it was not meant to instill fear, but responsibility. The symbol served as a constant reminder that one's actions, thoughts, and moral choices are never isolated or without consequence. The eye represented not surveillance by an earthly power, but accountability to higher ethical principles. In this sense, the Eye of Providence symbolized conscience, itself an inner moral witness urging each individual toward integrity and self-awareness. Another powerful and central symbol in Masonic lodges is the black and white checkered floor. At first glance, it appears simple, even decorative, yet it carries deep philosophical significance. This pattern draws upon ancient understandings of the universe as a space defined by opposing forces, light and darkness, good and evil, order and chaos. Similar dualistic symbols can be found in cultures across the world. Within Freemasonry, however, the checkered floor takes on a more personal and ethical meaning. It represents human life itself, a journey shaped by continuous choices and moral decisions. Standing upon this floor during ceremonies, a Mason is reminded that existence is not divided into purely good or purely evil paths. Instead, life unfolds in complex contrasts, demanding reflection, balance, and responsibility. Each step taken across the patterned floor symbolizes a decision, each with the potential to move one closer to moral clarity or moral compromise. Equally important in Masonic symbolism are the two legendary columns known as Boaz and Jachin. These pillars originate from biblical descriptions of the entrance to King Solomon's temple in Jerusalem. According to scripture, the columns stood at the threshold of the sacred space and carried profound symbolic meaning even in ancient times. In Freemasonry, Boaz and Jachin became philosophical metaphors for the dual nature of human existence. Boaz, traditionally placed on the left, represents strength, stability, and endurance. It reflects the physical and material aspects of life, resilience, effort, and the ability to withstand challenges. Jachin, positioned on the right, symbolizes wisdom, growth, and spiritual aspiration. Together, they remind the Mason that a balanced life requires both inner development and material grounding, intellect and effort, spirit and action. Another highly recognizable and often misunderstood image in Masonic symbolism is the pyramid, frequently depicted alongside the all-seeing eye. Many associate this symbol with ancient Egypt or occult ideologies. Yet within Freemasonry, its meaning is far more philosophical than mystical. The pyramid represents the human journey toward moral and intellectual elevation. Its wide base symbolizes the beginning of life's path, where attention is focused on survival, material needs, and basic desires. As the pyramid narrows toward the top, it reflects the gradual refinement of character, discipline of the mind, and purification of intention. Each upward level symbolizes self-improvement, learning, and ethical growth. The eye positioned at the apex represents enlightenment, a state in which an individual sees the world with clarity, wisdom, and moral awareness. The image of the pyramid with the all-seeing eye became widely known through its appearance on the Great Seal of the United States, adopted in 1782. While the symbol itself was not created by Freemasonry, several individuals involved in the seal's design were influenced by Enlightenment ideals closely associated with Masonic philosophy. As a result, this image became permanently linked in the public imagination with Freemasonry. Taken together, these symbols were never meant to obscure truth or manipulate society. Instead, they were designed as tools for reflection, a visual language meant to teach moral responsibility, balance, self-awareness, and the pursuit of wisdom. For Freemasons, symbolism was not about secrecy for its own sake, but about guiding the individual along an inner path of ethical and intellectual refinement, where each symbol served as a mirror reflecting the deeper questions of human existence. Freemasons and occultism, myths and reality. And despite the deep philosophical meaning behind Masonic rituals and symbolism, the Brotherhood has been surrounded for centuries by persistent myths, accusations, and even claims of Satanism. These accusations did not arise by chance. They are closely linked to the closed nature of Freemasonry, the secrecy of its rituals, and widespread misunderstandings of its true purpose. To understand where these legends came from, it is necessary to turn to history. The earliest suspicions that Freemasonry was connected to occult practices appeared as early as the 15th century, when Masonic lodges began spreading actively across Europe. Meetings were held behind closed doors, and members were bound by strict rules of confidentiality regarding internal rituals and teachings. For outsiders, such secrecy appeared suspicious and unsettling. In the medieval and early modern world, any closed society with unknown rituals was easily perceived as dangerous. Human imagination tends to fill gaps in understanding with fantasy, and fear often gives rise to dark and disturbing stories. Religious institutions reacted especially sharply. The Catholic Church, in particular, viewed Freemasonry as ideological rival. In 1738, Pope Clement XII issued a formal papal bull condemning Freemasonry and declaring Masonic gatherings illegal. The Church accused Freemasons of heresy, secret oaths, and rejection of divine authority and traditional social order. This official condemnation greatly influenced public perception and laid the groundwork for countless rumors accusing Freemasons of engaging in forbidden rites, magical practices, and moral corruption. In the 19th century, these suspicions intensified dramatically due to a broader cultural fascination with mysticism and the occult. During this period, one individual played a particularly significant role in shaping the dark image of Freemasonry, the French writer Léo Taxil. In the 1880s, Taxil published a series of sensational books and articles claiming that Freemasons secretly worshipped Lucifer, practiced satanic rituals, and plotted against Christianity and society. His writings caused a worldwide scandal, were widely translated, and deeply influenced public opinion. Later, Taxil publicly admitted that his stories were an elaborate hoax. He confessed that the entire project had been a deliberate satire meant to mock religious authorities and expose gullibility. However, by the time the truth emerged, the damage had already been done. The myths had taken root and continued to circulate long after the author's confession, reinforced by conspiracy theorists and sensationalist writers. Another factor fueling these misconceptions was the existence of other secret societies that emerged in the 19th century and genuinely practiced mystical or occult rituals while borrowing Masonic symbols and structure. One notable example is the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, founded in England in 1888. Although it was not officially connected to Freemasonry, it adopted many ceremonial elements reminiscent of Masonic traditions. For the general public, the distinction between these groups became blurred, reinforcing the belief that Freemasonry itself was an occult practice. In the 20th century, conspiracy narratives grew even more extreme. Publications like the Protocols of the Elders of Zion and Known Forgery falsely linked Freemasons to global conspiracies and secret domination over world affairs. These fabrications further solidified the image of Freemasons as shadowy figures manipulating society from behind the scenes. Totalitarian regimes, most notably Nazi Germany, exploited these myths to justify persecution of Freemasons, portraying them as enemies of the state and dangerous secret conspirators. In reality, accusations of Satanism or occult worship within Freemasonry have never been supported by credible evidence. They emerged from a combination of secrecy, religious and political conflict, fear of the unknown, and intentional deception. Freemasonry's rituals are symbolic, moral, and philosophical in nature, not magical or demonic. Its symbolism was designed to teach ethical responsibility, self-discipline, and intellectual growth, not to summon hidden powers or worship dark forces. Even today, despite countless historical clarifications and scholarly research, these myths continue to circulate in popular culture. Fear, mystery, and secrecy remain powerful forces in the human imagination. While they inspire curiosity, they also perpetuate misunderstanding. The story of Freemasonry and occultism serves as a reminder of how easily symbols can be misinterpreted and how myths, once born, can outlive the truth itself. Freemasonry and politics, influence and interaction. From the very beginning of its emergence, Freemasonry attracted people who sought not only personal moral and spiritual improvement but also meaningful change within society itself. Because of this, Freemasons inevitably became visible figures on the political stage. The ideals promoted within Masonic lodges align closely with the core values of the Enlightenment: liberty, equality, reason, tolerance, and human dignity. Rather than forming a covert power structure, Freemasonry functioned as a space where progressive ideas could be exchanged freely in times when public discussion was often restricted. One of the most striking and historically significant examples of Masonic influence can be found in the American Revolution. Many of the founding fathers of the United States were active Freemasons, including George Washington, the nation's first president. Washington did not conceal his membership. On the contrary, he openly embraced it. In 1793, he personally presided over the Masonic cornerstone-laying ceremony of the United States Capitol. During this event, Washington wore traditional Masonic regalia, including a ceremonial apron, and followed ritual gestures and readings that symbolized unity, moral responsibility, and collective purpose. To those present, the ceremony represented the birth of a new nation founded upon principles of fraternity, equality, and shared civic duty. Another central figure was Benjamin Franklin, a statesman, philosopher, diplomat, and scientist. Franklin played a crucial role in drafting both the Declaration of Independence and the U.S. Constitution, but his influence extended far beyond American borders. As a respected Freemason in France, Franklin used his extensive lodge connections to secure France's vital support for the American revolutionary cause. This support came in the form of funding, military assistance, naval forces, and diplomatic backing. Franklin was highly esteemed in European Masonic circles and was welcomed with exceptional honors in prestigious lodges such as the famous Persian Lodge of the Nine Sisters. His Masonic affiliations helped bridge continents and transform revolutionary ideals into tangible political outcomes. Freemasonry also played an influential Role in the French Revolution of 1789. Many key revolutionary figures were Freemasons, including Honor Gabriel Riquetti, Count of Mirabeau, Georges Danton, and the Marquis de Lafayette. Lafayette, often described as the hero of two revolutions, served as a link between the ideals of the American and French revolutions. Masonic lodges in France were among the few places where people from different social classes, nobility, intellectuals, merchants, and professionals could gather as equals and openly discuss political reform without immediate fear of censorship or repression. These discussions significantly contributed to the spread of Enlightenment ideals, which eventually crystallized into the revolutionary motto liberty, equality, fraternity. In Latin America, Freemasonry also became a powerful force for political transformation during the early 19th century. A key figure was Simon Bolivar, the legendary leader who played a central role in liberating Venezuela, Colombia, Ecuador, Peru, and Bolivia from Spanish colonial rule. Bolivar was initiated into Freemasonry in London in 1803, where he encountered progressive European ideas regarding freedom, national sovereignty, and self-governance. He later relied extensively on Masonic networks to connect revolutionaries across borders. In many Latin American regions, Masonic lodges became centers of strategic planning and cooperation, allowing individuals of different backgrounds and nationalities to unite in the shared struggle against colonial domination. Through these networks, Bolivar successfully built an international coalition that transformed revolutionary ideals into political reality. Italy's unification in the 19th century also saw strong Masonic influence. Giuseppe Garibaldi, a national hero and revolutionary leader, was openly proud of his Masonic affiliation. In 1864, he was elected Grand Master of the Grand Orient of Italy. Garibaldi used Masonic symbolism, shared values, and rituals to strengthen unity, discipline, and morale among revolutionary forces. These bonds proved instrumental in bringing together fragmented political movements and regional factions, ultimately contributing to the creation of a unified Italian state. In Britain, Freemasonry likewise exerted a notable social and political impact, particularly during the 18th and 19th centuries. Numerous political leaders, reformers, and philanthropists belonged to Masonic lodges. Winston Churchill, later Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, was initiated into Freemasonry in 1901, though he did not remain an active participant. His membership nevertheless symbolized the strong presence of Freemasonry within British elite circles. Earlier, British lodges played a significant role in charitable and social reform efforts, establishing schools, hospitals, and aid programs for the poor, demonstrating a practical application of Masonic ideals beyond symbolism and ritual, contrary to popular conspiracy theories. Freemasonry was never a single hidden hand governing world events from the shadows. Instead, it functioned as an intellectual and ethical framework that encouraged communication, cooperation, and moral reflection among individuals positioned to influence society. Its lodges provided spaces where progressive ideas could be debated and refined, often long before they became acceptable in public discourse. From the American Revolution to the liberation of Latin America and the unification of Italy, Freemasonry left a discernible imprint on world history. No other fraternal organization has been surrounded by as much suspicion, speculation, and myth. Yet when examined closely, its political influence reveals less about secret control and more about the power of shared ideals, dialogue, and human aspiration toward freedom and dignity. Freemasonry and conspiracy theories, facts and fabrications. From the very beginning of its history, Freemasonry has found itself at the center of the most extraordinary conspiracy theories. It has been accused of secretly controlling world events, manipulating revolutions, and even orchestrating a single hidden global government. These ideas did not arise randomly. They emerged during times of profound social upheaval, when people searched for simple explanations to complex and often frightening historical transformations. The first major wave of conspiracy thinking surrounding Freemasonry appeared shortly after the French Revolution. Europe was deeply shaken by the collapse of long-standing political and religious structures, and many struggled to accept that such radical change could result from social tensions, economic hardship, and philosophical ideas alone. In this atmosphere of uncertainty, the notion of a hidden guiding force became appealing. One of the earliest and most influential proponents of this idea was the French writer Abbé Augustin Barruel. In his book Memoirs illustrating the history of Jacobinism, he argued that the revolution was not a spontaneous uprising, but a carefully planned conspiracy involving Freemasons, Enlightenment philosophers, and Jacobins working together to destroy monarchy and religion. Barruel's work became a bestseller and was widely circulated across Europe. His claims, although lacking real evidence, created a powerful narrative that cast Freemasons as secret revolutionary masterminds. This interpretation deeply shaped public perception and planted the seeds for later conspiracy theories that persist to this day. Another decisive episode in the mythology surrounding Freemasonry was the infamous hoax created by Leo Taxil in the late 19th century. Taxil, a former anti-clerical writer who later claimed to have returned to Catholicism, launched an elaborate and sensational campaign portraying Freemasons as Satanists who worship Lucifer. He invented a fictional secret organization called the Palladium, which he claimed ruled all Masonic lodges worldwide and practiced dark, occult rituals. His stories were written in vivid detail and presented as factual exposes. They were taken seriously even by high-ranking church officials, and were printed in enormous numbers. In 1897, however, Leo Taxil publicly admitted that the entire story had been a deliberate fabrication designed as a satire. Despite this confession, the damage was already done. The image of Freemasonry as a demonic cult had taken root in popular imagination and continued to circulate long after the hoax was exposed. In the early 20th century, conspiracy mythology surrounding Freemasonry intensified even further with the appearance of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. This document, later conclusively proven to be a forgery, described an alleged plan for global domination supposedly orchestrated by Jewish elites and Freemasons. Despite being officially exposed as false in 1921, the document was widely used by extremist and anti-Semitic movements, including Nazi propaganda. Once again, Freemasonry was portrayed as part of a shadowy force, threatening civilization itself. One of the most persistent myths to emerge from these narratives is the idea of a unified global Masonic authority, often referred to as a world government. In reality, this concept is fundamentally incompatible with the actual structure of Freemasonry. Masonic lodges have never been governed by a single international leadership. Instead, they are organized into independent jurisdictions that operate autonomously. In many cases, different Masonic bodies have disagreed with one another or even existed in open rivalry due to differences in tradition, governance, or ideology. This decentralized reality directly contradicts the notion of a coordinated global conspiracy. Similarly, the claim that Freemasonry secretly orchestrated revolutions does not withstand historical scrutiny. While it is true that many revolutionary figures were Freemasons, membership alone does not imply centralized control. Lodges functioned primarily as meeting places where ideas could be exchanged freely, especially in societies where censorship limited open discussion. Within the same lodges, it was common to find people holding radically different political views. During the French Revolution, for example, Freemasons included both advocates of constitutional monarchy and radical Republicans who fiercely opposed one another. The endurance of conspiracy Theories about Freemasonry reveals more about human psychology than about the brotherhood itself. When faced with rapid change, crisis, or uncertainty, people often favor simplified explanations over complex realities. Freemasonry, with its closed meetings, symbolic rituals, and reluctance to reveal internal practices, provided an ideal target for projection. Its secrecy, intended to preserve tradition and symbolism, was easily reinterpreted as evidence of hidden power. Ultimately, conspiracy theories surrounding Freemasonry emerged not from factual evidence, but from a combination of fear, misunderstanding, political struggle, and deliberate misinformation. While these myths continue to circulate, a closer examination of history reveals a far more grounded reality, one in which Freemasonry served not as a clandestine puppet master, but as a forum for dialogue, moral reflection, and the exchange of ideas in times when free discussion was often discouraged or forbidden. Freemasons in Russia. History and influence. Unlike the waves of revolutions that reshaped Western Europe, the history of Freemasonry in Russia followed a distinct and more restrained path. Russian Freemasons never formed secret governments, nor did they stand behind mass uprisings or political conspiracies. Instead, Russian Masonry developed primarily as an intellectual and moral movement, closely connected to the educated elite of society and, at times, even to the imperial court itself. Freemasonry first entered Russia during the reign of Peter the Great, who was deeply fascinated by Western ideas, sciences, and social structures. His extensive travels across Europe and determination to modernize Russia created favorable conditions for the introduction of Enlightenment ideas, including Masonic philosophy. However, the real flourishing of Freemasonry in Russia occurred later, during the reign of Empress Catherine II. Especially in the second half of the 18th century, Catherine the Great herself was never a member of a Masonic lodge and viewed Freemasonry with a degree of suspicion. At the same time, many of her closest advisors, courtiers, and high-ranking officials were active Freemasons. These individuals played a significant role in shaping Russia's cultural and intellectual life. One of the most influential Masons at court was Prince Alexander Mikhailovich Golitsyn, a prominent statesman who enjoyed Catherine's personal trust. Through figures like Golitsyn, Masonic ideals of moral improvement, education, and service to society subtly spread among the Russian elite. Masonic lodges in Russia soon became gathering places for the brightest minds of the aristocracy, including high-ranking nobles, civil servants, scholars, writers, and publishers. One of the most famous and respected lodges was the Three Stars Lodge in St. Petersburg. Its members included notable figures such as the journalist and publisher Nikolai Ivanovich Novikov, the senator and political thinker Ivan Porfilievich Yelagin, and the writer and philosopher Alexander Radishchev. A defining feature of Russian Freemasonry was its strong focus on moral self-improvement rather than revolution. Russian Masons believed that genuine social progress began with the ethical transformation of the individual. As a result, they placed great emphasis on education, philanthropy, and cultural development. Lodges sponsored schools, libraries, printing presses, and charitable institutions. They viewed enlightenment not as a political weapon, but as a path to creating a more just and virtuous society from within. One of the most striking examples of Masonic influence in Russia was the work of Nikolai Ivanovich Novikov. A passionate Enlightenment thinker, Novikov devoted his life to spreading knowledge. He established printing houses and published journals, newspapers, and books that introduced Russian readers to European philosophy, ethics, economics, and literature. Through his efforts, the works of French Enlightenment thinkers became widely accessible in Russia for the first time. Initially, Catherine II viewed Novikov's activities favorably, considering them beneficial to public education and intellectual growth. However, political winds soon shifted. As the French Revolution unfolded and radical ideas spread across Europe, Russian authorities began to grow increasingly wary of all secret societies, including Masonic lodges. This suspicion deepened dramatically with the accession of Emperor Paul I in 1796. Paul I was deeply distrustful of any organization that operated behind closed doors. He associated secret societies with revolutionary chaos and ideological subversion, fearing that Enlightenment ideas could undermine autocratic rule. In 1798, he issued a sweeping ban on all Masonic activity within the Russian Empire. This prohibition was strict and uncompromising. Former Masons, many of whom held prestigious government positions, were forced to publicly renounce their membership. Those who disobeyed faced severe consequences, including loss of rank, exile, and confiscation of property. The repression was not merely symbolic. Printing houses connected to Masonic circles were shut down. Books and journals influenced by Masonic thought were confiscated or destroyed, and many prominent figures associated with Freemasonry were removed from public life. In a matter of years, a vibrant intellectual movement was effectively extinguished. Thus, the history of Freemasonry in Russia during the 18th century became a story of dramatic rise and abrupt collapse, shaped almost entirely by the attitudes and fears of individual rulers. Under Catherine the Great, Masons operated with relative freedom, spreading education and Enlightenment ideas. Under Paul I, they were harshly suppressed, bringing Masonic public activity to an almost complete halt. Despite the ban, the ideas promoted by Russian Freemasons did not disappear. They continued to circulate quietly among intellectuals, writers, and reform-minded thinkers, influencing the next generation of Russian culture and philosophy. With the accession of Alexander I in 1801, Freemasonry experienced a brief revival. The new emperor was more tolerant toward Enlightenment ideals, and for a short time, Russian Masonry regained some of its intellectual significance before once again fading under later political pressures. In Russia, Freemasonry was never a revolutionary engine, but rather a moral and educational project, one that sought to refine the individual as a means of elevating society as a whole. The influence of Freemasonry on Russian culture. During this period, Masonic lodges increasingly became centers of intellectual attraction for prominent cultural figures, especially writers, historians, philosophers, and publicists whose work shaped Russian literature and social thought for generations. Freemasonry in Russia influenced culture not through political action, but through ideas, moral renewal, human dignity, responsibility, and the inner freedom of the individual. One of the most significant figures shaped by Masonic ideals was Nikolai Mikhailovich Karamzin, the great Russian historian and writer. Best known as the author of History of the Russian State, Karamzin did not hide his affiliation with Masonic lodges and took an active part in their intellectual life. Within Freemasonry, he encountered a worldview that emphasized morality, humanism, historical responsibility, and the ethical destiny of nations. These ideas deeply influenced Karamzin's historical and philosophical reflections. His vision of Russian history was not merely a chronicle of rulers and wars, but a moral narrative about the development of society, law, and culture. Through his writings, Masonic concepts of enlightenment, virtue, and moral progress entered the broader intellectual discourse of Russia. The cultural circle surrounding Karamzin played a decisive role in shaping the Russian intelligentsia of the early 19th century, for whom Masonic ideals of ethical refinement and service to society were especially compelling. Alexander Sergeyevich Pushkin, although not formally initiated into a Masonic lodge, was closely connected with individuals who were active Freemasons. The influence of Masonic thought on Pushkin was indirect but profound. He maintained close relationships with the Decembrists, many of whom were members of Masonic lodges, and these connections significantly shaped his liberal worldview. Themes central to Freemasonry: freedom, conscience, moral responsibility, and the role of the individual in history appear repeatedly in Pushkin's works. They are reflected in Eugene Onegin, Boris Godunov, and many of his poems, where reflections on power, destiny, justice, and inner freedom echo the philosophical discussions common in Masonic circles of the time. Pushkin's writing helped transform these ideas into timeless literary expressions accessible far beyond elite intellectual societies. Another important cultural figure was Alexander Fyodorovich Labzin, a philosopher, writer, and publisher who actively promoted the ideals of moral self-perfection and spiritual development. In the 1810s, Labzin published the journal The Zion Herald, which became a key platform for the spiritual and philosophical life of educated Russian society. The journal featured philosophical essays, translations of European thinkers, and texts directly inspired by Masonic spirituality. It addressed questions of conscience, ethical duty, inner transformation, and the relationship between the individual and society. The Zion Herald gained wide popularity among the educated elite and played a major role in spreading Masonic-influenced ideas of moral improvement and public service throughout Russian intellectual life. However, this cultural flowering did not last indefinitely. After the Decembrist uprising of 1825, the government of Emperor Nicholas I once again turned against Freemasonry. Masonic lodges were increasingly viewed by authorities as breeding grounds of free thought, liberalism, and potential threats to autocratic power. Repression followed. Lodges were shut down, publications restricted, and intellectual circles associated with Freemasonry closely monitored. Despite these crackdowns, the cultural influence of Freemasonry in Russia had already taken firm root. Its values, ethical responsibility, human dignity, enlightenment, and inner freedom continued to live on in literature, philosophy, and historical thought. Even after the lodges themselves were silenced, their ideas survived, woven into the fabric of Russian culture through the works of its greatest writers and thinkers. In this way, Freemasonry in Russia left a legacy not of political control or secrecy, but of cultural depth and moral inquiry, quietly shaping the inner world of Russian intellectual life long after the Brotherhood itself faded from public view. Freemasonry in Russia in the 20th century: transformation and decline during the decades that followed the strict prohibitions of the 19th century. Freemasonry in Russia existed almost entirely underground, cut off from public life and closely monitored by the authorities. It gradually lost its former influence and, in practical terms, ceased open activity altogether. A brief and fragile revival occurred in the early 20th century. After the Revolution of 1905, Russia experienced a surge of social, political, and intellectual movements. In this atmosphere of cautious liberalization, Masonic lodges once again appeared in St. Petersburg, Moscow, and several major cities of the Russian Empire. However, this revival was modest. The lodges no longer played the prominent cultural and philosophical role they had enjoyed during the Enlightenment or under Alexander I. Their influence was limited, their membership relatively small, and their activities far more discreet. Everything changed dramatically after the October Revolution of 1917. The new Soviet government immediately declared Freemasonry illegal, viewing it as a bourgeois, anti-Soviet organization incompatible with communist ideology. Secret societies, independent intellectual circles, and any form of transnational association were perceived as direct threats to the new political order. As a result, many Russian Freemasons were forced into emigration. Entire lodges effectively went into exile, relocating primarily to France and other European countries. In Paris and several other European capitals, Russian Masonic lodges were established, becoming gathering places for members of the Russian émigré intelligentsia, writers, philosophers, scholars, and former public figures who had fled the Soviet regime. Among those associated with émigré Masonic circles were influential thinkers of the Russian diaspora, including philosophers such as Nikolai Berdyaev, who, while critical of rigid organizations, actively participated in intellectual environments shaped by Masonic humanism. In exile, Freemasonry served less as an institution of influence and more as a space for reflection, cultural continuity, and moral dialogue, an attempt to preserve pre-revolutionary intellectual traditions and ethical values. However, this émigré Freemasonry faced serious limitations. Separated from their homeland, lacking influence over events in Soviet Russia, and gradually losing members as the older generation passed away, the movement slowly declined. By the mid-20th century, Russian Masonic lodges in exile had largely faded into the background of emigrant cultural life. Inside the Soviet Union, Freemasonry remained completely prohibited throughout the entire 20th century. The communist system rejected any independent philosophical or spiritual organizations outside state control. Masonic activity, even in the form of private discussion circles, was effectively impossible. For decades, Freemasonry existed only as a subject of rumor, propaganda, or distorted myths within Soviet society. Only toward the end of the 20th century, during the era of perestroika and especially after the collapse of the USSR, did attempts emerge to revive Freemasonry in Russia. New lodges were established in a radically different political and social environment, one no longer defined by imperial structures or revolutionary ideology, but by a search for identity in a post-Soviet world. This modern revival, however, did not restore Freemasonry's former influence. Unlike earlier centuries, contemporary Russian Freemasonry does not play a central role in shaping culture, philosophy, or politics. It exists openly, legally, and peacefully, but on the margins of public life, without the broad intellectual authority it once possessed. Today, Freemasonry is not a relic of the past, but a living though limited social phenomenon. Modern Masonic organizations operate openly in many countries around the world, including Russia. Yet myths, suspicions, and conspiracy theories surrounding them remain widespread. This raises an important question that naturally follows from this long and complex history. What is Freemasonry in the modern world, and what role, if any, does it truly play today? Contemporary Freemasonry, trends and challenges. According to the most recent estimates, there are approximately 6 million Freemasons worldwide today. The largest concentration is found in the United States, where more than 2 million people are members of Masonic lodges. American Freemasonry is notable for its openness and visibility. In the United States, Masonic organizations often engage in public life. They host official ceremonies, charity events, open houses, and even guided tours of historic lodge buildings, allowing the general public to better understand their history and activities. The United Kingdom is another major center of modern Freemasonry, with around 200,000 members. British Masonic organizations are similarly transparent. They openly publish information about their activities, support large-scale charitable initiatives, and actively cooperate with social and community organizations. Freemasonry in Britain has deep historical roots and continues to be seen as a respectable civic institution rather than a secretive society. In Western Europe, Freemasonry also maintains a long-standing tradition and relatively stable membership. In France, there are approximately 150,000 Freemasons, while Germany counts close to 100,000 members. In recent decades, interest in Freemasonry has grown slightly in these countries, particularly among middle-aged individuals and representatives of creative and intellectual professions seeking philosophical dialogue, ethical reflection, and a sense of structured community. In Eastern Europe, Masonic organizations are generally smaller. However, after the collapse of the Soviet Union and the Socialist bloc, Freemasonry began a gradual revival across the region. Today, Masonic lodges operate legally and openly in most Eastern European countries, even though their social influence remains modest compared to Western Europe or the United States. So what do modern Masonic lodges actually do today? First and foremost, Freemasonry has preserved its original purpose as a fraternity dedicated to moral, philosophical, and intellectual development. Lodges continue to hold regular meetings, perform rituals, engage in symbolic traditions, and discuss ethical questions, philosophy, and history in an atmosphere of equality and mutual respect. And like in earlier centuries, these discussions no longer carry the same level of secrecy that once fueled countless myths and suspicions. The central focus of Freemasonry in the 21st century, however, is charitable and social work. In countries such as the United States and the United Kingdom, Masonic organizations donate tens of millions of dollars every year to medical research, children's hospitals, educational institutions, and humanitarian programs. Freemasons fund hospitals, support children with serious illnesses, operate free clinics, and provide assistance to disadvantaged communities. In some regions, Masonic hospitals and medical centers are regarded among the best in terms of both quality of care and accessibility. Another major area of activity is the support of education and culture. Masonic lodges frequently sponsor schools and universities, award scholarships to talented students, fund research projects, and contribute to the preservation of historical heritage. In the United Kingdom, for example, Freemasons regularly donate substantial sums toward the restoration of historic buildings, both those connected to Freemasonry and monuments of broader national and cultural importance. When it comes to political influence, modern Freemasonry differs sharply from its historical role. Contemporary Masonic organizations strongly emphasize their apolitical stance. Most lodges explicitly prohibit discussions of active politics and religion during meetings in order to avoid internal divisions and conflicts. This rule is widely enforced and carefully monitored by leadership across jurisdictions. As a result, the real political influence of Freemasonry today is minimal and bears little resemblance to the role it played during the Enlightenment, Revolutionary eras, or the formation of modern states. Freemasonry no longer seeks to shape political systems or guide governments. Instead, it functions primarily as a moral, philanthropic, and cultural institution adapted to modern democratic societies. Modern Freemasonry thus faces a number of challenges: aging membership in some regions, competition with other forms of social engagement, persistent myths and conspiracy theories, and the difficulty of maintaining relevance in a rapidly changing world. Yet despite these challenges, it continues to exist as a global fraternity, less powerful, less mysterious, but more open than ever before, focused on ethical reflection, charity, and service rather than secrecy and control. Freemasonry in popular culture, reflection and perception. And despite the openness and transparency of modern Masonic lodges, Freemasonry continues to provoke myths, suspicion, and distrust among certain audiences who prefer to see hidden motives and secret agendas behind its symbols. In reality, modern Freemasonry, especially since the 20th century, functions as a philosophical and charitable organization focused primarily on moral self-improvement, mutual support, and service to society. Contemporary Freemasons openly speak about their goals, publish information about events and activities, and actively work to maintain a positive public image. Yet centuries-old legends and speculation have left a deep imprint on the collective imagination. As a result, Freemasonry has long transcended the realm of academic history and become a powerful and recurring image in popular culture. In films, novels, television series, and even video games, Freemasonry is frequently used as a central theme or an important narrative device. The reason is obvious: secrecy, ritual, symbols, and a long, partially hidden history easily capture attention and ignite curiosity. One of the most influential cultural works to revive global interest in secret societies was Dan Brown's novel The Da Vinci Code. Although the story primarily revolves around the Catholic Church and various mystical traditions, it reignited fascination with secret brotherhoods in general, including Freemasonry. Brown's later novel, The Lost Symbol, addressed Freemasonry directly, portraying it as a guardian of ancient wisdom and esoteric knowledge hidden within symbols, architecture, and ritual. While these portrayals are highly fictionalized, they significantly shaped public perception and brought Freemasonry back into mainstream cultural discussion. Another major example is the film National Treasure starring Nicolas Cage. In this adventure story, the plot centers on secret knowledge and hidden treasures supposedly protected by Freemasons for generations. Although the film makes no claim to historical accuracy, it presents Freemasons as custodians of cultural memory and foundational ideals tied to the origins of modern democracy. This portrayal helped popularize Masonic imagery such as symbols, secret chambers, and encoded messages among a wide audience. In literature, beyond Dan Brown, Freemasonry often appears as part of broader philosophical and metafictional explorations. A notable example is Foucault's Pendulum by Italian writer Umberto Eco. In this intellectually dense novel, Masonic and occult societies are woven into an intricate narrative that examines the human tendency to find meaning, patterns, and hidden orders even where none truly exist. Eco's work does not glorify secret societies, but rather uses them to explore how belief systems, conspiracy thinking, and symbols influence society. Across popular culture, Freemasonry is often portrayed as far more powerful, unified, and secretive than it actually is. These representations blur the line between fact and fiction, reinforcing myths that persist despite historical evidence. Still, such portrayals also reflect a deeper human fascination with mysteries, hidden knowledge, and the idea that history contains layers not immediately visible. In this way, Freemasonry in popular culture functions less as an accurate representation of a real institution and more as a symbolic canvas, a mirror reflecting humanity's enduring attraction to secrecy, meaning, and the unknown. Whether depicted as benevolent guardians of ancient wisdom or shadowy architects of hidden plans, Freemasonry continues to live a second life in imagination, shaped more by storytelling than by history itself. The influence of Freemasons on culture and society. Video games have also played a significant role in shaping the modern image of Freemasonry. One of the most notable examples is the globally popular Assassin's Creed franchise. This series draws heavily on the theme of secret societies, often blending Freemasons, Illuminati, Knights Templar, and other enigmatic groups into a centuries-long hidden conflict that unfolds behind the visible course of history. The games are built on alternative historical narratives and conspiracy theories, presenting secret brotherhoods as powerful actors influencing human civilization from the shadows. The popularity of Assassin's Creed has been immense, especially among younger audiences. Its richly detailed worlds, symbolic storytelling, and historical references have introduced millions of players to the idea of secret societies governing unseen layers of reality. Despite the fictionalized nature of its plots, the series has sparked genuine curiosity about real historical brotherhoods, leading many players to explore the true history of Freemasonry, its symbols, and its philosophical foundations. However, such widespread cultural usage of Masonic imagery is not without consequences. Films, novels, and video games often significantly distort historical facts and exaggerate the power, secrecy, and unity of Freemasonry. These portrayals frequently suggest that modern lodges are engaged in hidden political control, mystical rituals, or global conspiracies, creating a misleading picture of what Freemasonry truly represents today. As a result, fictional narratives sometimes reinforce old suspicions rather than promoting historical understanding. At the same time, cultural popularity also has a positive effect. By continuously reintroducing Freemasonry into the public conversation, popular culture invites people to question myths and seek out reliable sources. Many viewers, readers, and gamers begin their journey with fiction, but eventually turn to history, philosophy, and scholarly research to separate imagination from reality. And this way, popular culture becomes a gateway rather than an endpoint. Today, Freemasonry occupies a unique place in global culture. It exists simultaneously as a real philosophical fraternity dedicated to ethical self-improvement and charitable work, and as a powerful symbol of mystery, ancient wisdom, and hidden traditions in the collective imagination. Stories involving Freemasons provoke debate, inspire creativity, and encourage reflection on themes such as morality, freedom, power, and the search for meaning. Ultimately, it is precisely this cultural influence that keeps Freemasonry alive in public consciousness. Through books, films, games, and art, the Brotherhood continues to exist not only as a historical institution, but as a living idea, one that evolves with each generation and remains deeply woven into humanity's ongoing exploration of knowledge, identity, and the unseen dimensions of history. And so, our journey into the mysterious and fascinating world of Freemasonry comes to an end. Together, we have traced its long and complex history from medieval stonecutters and symbolic rituals to philosophical brotherhoods, political influence, cultural myths, and modern charitable organizations. Along the way, we explored how legends were born, how misconceptions took root, and how reality often turned out to be far more nuanced, human, and thoughtful than the dramatic stories told by conspiracy theories. Freemasonry is not a single secret controlling force, nor merely a relic of the past. It is a historical phenomenon shaped by its time, a space where ideas of morality, self-improvement, brotherhood, and intellectual freedom were able to exist even when the wider world was marked by intolerance and fear of new thought. Its symbols, rituals, and secrecy were not designed to dominate humanity, but to guide individuals on a personal inner path, one built on discipline, reflection, responsibility, and ethical growth. Understanding Freemasonry means learning to distinguish myth from fact, symbolism from literal interpretation, and fiction from history. When we do this, the image of the Brotherhood transforms from a shadowy legend into a mirror reflecting humanity's enduring desire for meaning, order, wisdom, and connection. Thank you for spending this time with me and allowing this lecture to become part of your quiet evening routine. If this journey brought you curiosity, calm, or new understanding, it has fulfilled its purpose. Stay with the channel, subscribe if you haven't already, and return with us for future lectures where history, mystery, and reflection meet once again. Until next time.